I'm with you this afternoon, this evening, your time, to discuss the imperative of structural change within art museums and to use the BMA's last 5 years as a sort of case study in that kind of structural change, and to point towards the end of my presentation to the what we imagine unfolding at the museum in the next 5 years. The purpose here is to make the strong case that museums in this country, in particular in the US, are in a period of grave crisis. We're under pressure from many constituents, activist groups, artist groups, community groups, to increase our relevance to the communities that we serve and to analyze every aspect of our functioning with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that those calls for change are long overdue. We've been doing that work for about 5 years. We have a long way to go, but it will be my pleasure to narrate some of the changes we've made and the changes we imagine making in the near future. So next slide, please. And the next one. So I'm not going to read these mission and vision statements, but I arrived at the museum in very late 2016, and by 2018, we had already been doing a lot of the work that I was drawn to Baltimore to do. Just to sketch my background a little bit, I am a post-war specialist, but within that, and in large part catalyzed by a very close relationship with the artist Mark Bradford, who, as Dorothy mentioned, represented the US in 2017 at the Venice Biennale. I've become an expert in the area, in particular of post-war painting and sculpture, both abstract and representational, by Black American artists. And I think in the course of getting to know Mark, and the history that explains his emergence as the great artist, as well as what I would refer to as a golden generation of Black American artists around him, I was extremely drawn to a city like Baltimore. It's a Black majority city. It has an extraordinary museum, an extraordinary collection, of course, but also, and I think really vitally, had a board of trustees that wanted to see rapid change within the institution. Did not quite know the means of that change and wanted the director to drive that vision. And I think that willingness to enact a change that they couldn't yet themselves imagine was a great draw for me. Personally, I wanted to take this golden generation of Black American artists, both the art and their thinking, and make them the leading edge of a civic institution as a way to differently bridge the relationship with a big public. So we began doing that work immediately, but in June of 2018, codified our mission and vision in 2 rewritten statements. And I think if you look at those sorts of mission and vision statements as associated with American museums, particularly encyclopedic ones, you'll find an extraordinary monotony of sentiment. And so what we attempted to do as an institution was distinguish ourselves not only in deeds, but in language. So these were intended to describe a different kind of museum with a different kind of mission and vision. And next slide, please. So one of the first and most visible things we undertook, and next slide, please, was a substantial deaccessioning in 2018, wherein we sold 7 paintings from our permanent collection, for roughly $18 million with the help of the auction house Sotheby's. And we very publicly stated that with the sale of these works, we were going to focus the proceeds entirely on post-war art by men and women of color, which we've done with extraordinary discipline since that moment of sale. So I'm going to walk you through the 7 paintings very quickly that we did sell. This is Robert Rauschenberg's Bank Job. It's an extraordinary work of art. It was almost impossible for us to show at the museum, and there was an enormous storage burden, and we are healthfully represented in the world of Rauschenberg anyway. So this was a very easy decision for us. The next work was by Andy Warhol. This is called Hearts from 1979. We are lucky to have about 95 works by Warhol in our collection, many of them late paintings. So again, the case was made here for extreme collection redundancy, and the object had tremendous value. And the next one, please. Another painting by Andy Warhol, again, a great oxidization painting from 1978, but we have two others of significantly greater aesthetic merit, so another easy decision. Kenneth Nolan, again, an adequately representative painting for Nolan, but we're very deep in this work, so an easy decision. And the next one too, another work by Kenneth Nolan, perhaps not his greatest work of art. This was this passed with absolutely no contest and sold for very little. Then next slide, please. A Jules Zalitsky painting. Again, we have extraordinarily deep holdings in this work. Before Darkness 2 did not significantly impact our ability to represent his legacy. And then finally, Green Cross by Franz Klein from 1956. So this decision to sell these 7 paintings created a significant stir in the art world, as some of you probably know. The impulse for me was simply to develop the kind of war chest necessary to be really active in the primary and secondary market, very conscious of the fact that we weren't only competing with museums, but we were competing with private collectors who had made it their business, in fact, to collect the work of this golden generation of Black American artists working in the present, but also looking back to account for their presence at the current time. So I felt very strongly that our acquisition endowments were not adequate to that task. I also felt very strongly that we needed to do this work of buying, reconstructing our collection incredibly quickly, while there was still a measure of economic opportunity. So the sort of sensational headlines in the press were, BMA sells 7 works by 7 white artists to buy work by African Americans, let's say, just to sort of simplify some of the sensationalizing headlines. And I take no issue with that at all, because of course we did sell 7 paintings by white male artists. But what I would say is that, of course we did, because that's where the redundancy within our collection as well as the value lies. So we have a roughly 96% male collection, which doesn't make us dissimilar from other encyclopedic collections. So if you're looking to Desession and you're also looking for value, you will inevitably find it within that mega majority of practitioners represented within the history you tell. So it was a little controversial at the time, since esteemed museums like SF MoMA, the AGO in Toronto, and others have followed suit, dispensing with objects from their collection to look back and look forward with an emphasis on diversity and equity. So next slide, please. I'm just going to run you very quickly through some of the really extraordinary acquisitions we've been able to make as a consequence. And next one, this is work by Benny Andrews from 1988. Called Blacksmith. And next slide. I'll just go very quickly here. Virginia Jaramillo from 1967. We showed this work very recently. And a younger artist born in 1977, Rashid Johnson, first work of his to enter the collection. Same for the previous 2. This is currently being installed in our contemporary wing, and that show will open in about 10 days. And next one. We have a really exaggerated commitment to work being made in Baltimore. This one is by Teresa Cremati. There's a great art school here, the Maryland MICA shorthand, and there is an extraordinary emphasis on socially engaged art production, and we want to announce loudly to the city and to the broader world our feeling that the work being made in Baltimore is exceptional, and we can develop a world-class museum program based in part on an investment in their work. So very much local and very much global in our focus, and Teresa is a good example of the local. And next slide, please. I'm increasingly interested in doing this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, looking backwards, just as we look forward. So this is a work by Louis Manuel Jones that entered the collection through the American department, not the contemporary department. And next slide. I'll just move more quickly. Lily Martin Spencer from 1858. Next slide. I include this because there's a balance that occurs in buying and gifting, not by design, but again, as a consequence of the way that collections, both private and institutional, have been built. So just as we distort our own discretionary spending towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, continually gifts, sculptures, paintings, and works on paper continue to roll in to the museum that continue to represent the very strong legacy of white male artists. So it's not as if we don't do both. We simply do both by different mechanisms. And next one, please. Our non-Western collecting areas are incredibly active as well. This is a very important work to enter our African collection from 1880. And next slide, please. I'm just give you a sense of the depth and breadth of our collecting too. I wouldn't say that we are fully encyclopedic in the sense of the Met. We are strongly demi-encyclopedic, as this work from Japan represents. And next one. It works on paper. Prints, drawings, and photographs represent about 67,000 of 95,000 objects in our collection. And we continue to develop that extraordinary strength, particularly drawing on the work of young artists like Ming Smith. And next slide, please. Okay, so now we're on to recent exhibitions, and I will, again, run fast through these. Point being, mission and vision ground all of our actions. Of course, I think the primary expression of that should be in the programmatic linchpins of the museum, so exhibitions, acquisitions, and public programs. Exhibitions being one of our big drivers. This was a show that we co-organized with the Metropolitan Museum of Art that surveyed the sculpture of the late, great, and extraordinary painter that we revealed as sculpture, Jack Whitten. And we used this exhibition to dedicate new changing exhibition spaces, again, as a way to articulate with great strength the conviction that we have around diversifying the history of art that we tell looking backwards and looking forwards. It would have been far more straightforward and far more lucrative for us to simply do a Matisse show, a Picasso show, or a Dali show, which we could ground absolutely in our holdings. But I think it was important to, as they say, come out of the gate with something more representative of a different future. And next slide. This, just very briefly, this is an installation view of the Mark Bradford exhibition that existed in Venice. We then brought it back to Baltimore, installed it exactly as it was in Venice on our contemporary wing, and offered it to the city of Baltimore free of charge, which I think is enormously important given the fact that the BMA was the commissioning entity. But Venice as a concept, as a space, is so remote and financially prohibitive for the majority that we wanted to make sure we brought this great moment home and opened it to the city free of charge, and it was a monstrous attendance success, and due to the quality of the work, but also due to the myth of Mr. Bradford too. Next slide, please. John Waters, local hero. He's as I was joking actually before this began, when John Waters sneezes, there are 17 video cameras in front of him. So this show is an extraordinary success, revealing him not just as a personality or celebrity, but also as an artist with a many-year career. And next slide. Monsters and Myths, Transatlantic Surrealism in the 30s and 40s, maybe a more familiar subject, particularly in the context of European museums. And next slide. This was a titanic moment for our institution. This exhibition closed slightly before COVID began, and it is the largest collection of Black abstraction, painting and sculpture ever assembled by an institution. I think it's incredibly important to note that we were not able, despite our focus on collecting in that area, to actually organize that show and its history from our collection. We had to draw very heavily on a private collection assembled by the foremost collector in that area, Pamela Joyner, our own holdings, as well as other institutional holdings, in an effort to unfold this story. So nothing, I think, pointed more acutely to what we haven't done as an institution historically than our inability to present this show based on our holdings alone. And next slide. again, race isn't the only focus at our institution when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2020, we made the decision to commit every exhibition, every acquisition, and every public program to female identifying artists. And that, of course, was the first time in our history. This, again, made major waves in the press. People saw it as an expression of reverse discrimination. I personally see it as a way to look with clear eyes at the past and engage in a period of reparation with a view towards an equitable future. So again, to reiterate my point from earlier, we are a 96% white male collection. That's 97,000 objects. It would be absolutely impossible to make the case that that kind of percentage is based on a rational, bias-free analysis of history. That's simply not true. A collection like that materializes as a consequence of both conscious and unconscious bias. And so we wanted to make the case strongly that and announce to the world our intent to change that story going forward. And we did it with a pretty extraordinary roster of 27 exhibitions spanning all of our collecting areas, up to and including a soon to open retrospective of Joan Mitchell that was delayed by, I think, 2 years by the pandemic. So 2020 vision has in fact gone substantially beyond that calendar year. We'll be opening the Joan Mitchell show in the spring of 2022, and that will be the capstone moment for this initiative. And next slide, please. Just showing you installation views of a couple, Women Behaving Badly, 400 Years of Power and Protest. This is a largely permanent collection-based exhibition that's still on view until December 19th. And next slide, please. This exhibition of Juan Grie's work is up through January 9th. Again, many months delayed by the pandemic. And next slide. Just to point to this exhibition for 1 second, A Modern Influence, Henri Matisse, Etta Cohn in Baltimore. I was asked by the organizers of this lecture to speak, if only briefly, about what constitutes the strengths of the BMA's collection. And we are best known for our holdings in Matisse's work. We have the greatest, biggest, and deepest collection of his work in any public institution. And that happened in large part as a consequence of Etta Cohn and her sister Clarabelle, who, with some guidance from Gertrude Stein and others, traversed Europe in the early years of the 20th century, getting to know some of the most significant, particularly French practitioners of modernism, and then within that, Matisse. And so Etta Cohn, in particular, towards the end of her lifetime, very self-consciously built, in collaboration with Matisse, a retrospective of the artist's work in all media for Baltimore. And we unfold that story for the first time. Katie Rothkopf, one of our esteemed curators, was in charge, and she made the point to me that this had been quite literally 21 years in gestation. So 21 years is the period of time that Katie has served at this museum, and the show is exactly as intimate in its narration of this collection as you would imagine. And next slide, please. We have 2 new centers opening this December, and I wanted to speak very briefly to you about the nature of both. Next slide. The first is a center for the study of prints, drawings, and photographs. The intent here was to collapse the functioning of a museum, back of house and front of house, into one public space that the public could experience. So we have never in our history at the BMA, which spans 108 years, committed a gallery space, a study space, a conservation space, and a storage space to the biggest part of our collection, namely the prints, drawings, and photographs. That will be opening in December. Our collection in that area spans the late 15th century, roughly all the way to the present. It's a collection of extraordinary quality, and we can narrate a roughly uninterrupted history of Western art quite comprehensively over those many centuries. So I'm extraordinarily excited by the prospect of exercising our mission and vision, looking back just as looking forward. So there are quite literally thousands of exhibitions we could consider for our permanent collection, and this space will be responsible for a rotating roster of those shows. The next center to open is the Ruth Armada Center for Matisse Studies. Again, the intent here is to telegraph to the world what makes our collection great, and within that we have a particular emphasis on Matisse. Unlike the PDP Center, there is not a great focus on public presentation space here. Rather, it's a brain trust with a big endowment that will allow us to bring in scholars of all ages, all levels, and all geographies to the museum to study directly from Matisse's work in order to further analyze his career and I think complicate both his life and his legacy. So the first scholar we have coming is Denise Murrell, very well-known scholar currently in residence at the Met as well. And she'll be looking at Matisse's relationship to the art of North Africa. So extraordinary, interesting work upcoming. And next slide, please. This is just a slide demonstrating the first exhibition that will ground the Matisse Center, small gallery adjacent to the Matisse Center called the Sinuous Line. And next slide. And the first exhibition in the PDP Center, the Rembrandt Effect. And next slide. We are in the process at the moment of reinstalling many of our permanent collections with an emphasis on non-Western collections. Within that, I think I'm most excited about the representation of our Oceanic collection, which is one of the 2 or 3 best in the United States, has not been on view for decades. So that's a big moment for us. And it will occupy a gallery space directly adjacent to the PDP and Matisse centers, which I think is an instructive and also exciting juxtaposition. And next slide. I'm going to run through these very quickly just to give you a sense of how focused we are on mission and vision. We're reinstalling our contemporary collection again with a majority focus on post-war art by men and women of color, things that have languished in our collection for years and not been shown, things that we brought into the collection through our 2018 Desessioning, as well as bigger commissioned works that we've yet to present to our public. So a monumental moment upcoming November 14th. And next slide, please. Richard Yard. We make it a practice to look back in history and try to resuscitate figures who made a contribution of considerable magnitude to the history of art, who have not had a significant solo presentation in the museum or catalog. Richard Yard, the great African-American watercolorist, falls into that category. This is a touring exhibition that opens in November. And next slide. As the aforementioned Joan Mitchell retrospective, I think it's really important, again, to be self-critical about the history of this institution. When this exhibition opens, it will be the first monographic show focused on a woman artist, accompanied by a catalog that we have done in our 108-year history. So a difficult and shameful fact, perhaps, but as we always say, it's never too late to do the right thing. So that exhibition opens March 6th of next year. And next slide. We're doing an exhibition, again, something that garnered considerable public attention, that will be curated by 17 of our security officers who have spent years and years and years developing the most intimate of relationships with the works in our galleries that they guard. And so for the first time, at least in the history of the BMA, we're turning over the curatorial reins to them to present and interpret objects from our permanent collection. So this is again, very, very significant moment, and will open coincident with Joan Mitchell. So theoretically, the art world will descend and see both. And next slide. Very briefly, a movement in every direction, the legacy of the Great Migration. This shows our, I think, desire to connect directly with untold histories. This is an exhibition we're co-organizing with the Mississippi Museum of Art and has a nationwide tour. And it gathers together 10 of the most significant Black artists living and working in the US today to narrate the history of the Black exodus from the South across the country, and particularly to the North, beginning in the 30s and ending in the 70s, that completely reshaped the creative landscape of the United States. And next slide. This, I think, is a show that's most emblematic of our desire to enter mainstream consciousness. So this All Eyes on Me is a title that draws its inspiration from a Tupac Shakur album from the 90s. And this looks at the relationship between hip hop culture, fashion, and contemporary art spanning the 20th century into the first 2 decades of the 21st. And next slide. Renaissance Women, again, to reiterate my desire to take our mission and vision and exercise it looking backwards. This is a show co-organized with the AGO in Toronto, a group exhibition focused on female practitioners active across Europe during the Renaissance period. So massively ambitious and really exciting. And next one, please. Kehinde Wiley, he'll be making a series of portraits based on subjects in Baltimore, something we've never done, and I think a very direct way to dignify our audience and memorialize them through these extraordinary paintings. And Kehinde, of course, as you all know, was the artist responsible for the acclaimed Obama portrait. And next slide, please. All of these efforts that in collection development that we're going through will culminate in collection reinstallations. And next slide, please. Across the museum, beginning almost immediately through 2024, and then next slide, please, into the fall of 24, and then next slide, into 2026. The idea here, of course, is ambitious and highly complicated in execution, but essentially to narrate a history of art that doesn't rely so much on geographies and borders and more on time and the relationship between cultures. So a different kind of global art history that doesn't necessarily silo countries, but rather attempts to delineate the conversations that have occurred across time, across geography, to shape a new history of art. So enormously ambitious. We have a group of about 10 curators working on this concept, and it will unfold in bursts between now and the fall of 2026. And next slide, please. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to go through two final concepts. The first of them is our Lexington Market Outpost. So, I think one of the most interesting things that we have realized in the past 5 years is that it's important to go to people and deliver the content that's core to our program where they are, rather than relying on the whole of the city of Baltimore to come to the BMA to have an experience, then disperse back to their respective communities. We're aiming, I think, to function more like an American library looking forward. So American libraries tend to have a major branch and or a sort of a home base, a mothership, and then branches dotting the city. And we see that as a way to emphasize sharing over hoarding, going to people rather than requiring them to come to us. So this will be the first of our branches, and we hope to dedicate it in the middle of 2022. The Lexington Market is a public market space. It's the longest continually operating public market in the United States, and it will be home to a legitimate segment of our museum. Will actually live within that market space, ideally capturing an entirely new audience. So very ambitious, very risky, and very exciting. And then next slide, please. So then just looking forward and completing the picture that I'm trying to narrate to you all. And last slide, please. I've tried to emphasize many aspects of our functioning at the museum: exhibitions, acquisitions, public programs. I could have talked also about diversifying staff, diversifying board, looking with clear eyes at our investment strategy and making sure that diversity as a principle and as a value is registered in there, as well as our vendor selections. I will also say that money, of course, is an enormous part of this endeavor. And you're all, I'm sure, abundantly well aware that we proposed in October of 2020 to sell 3 paintings from our collection that would have generated an enormous endowment. That endowment would have allowed us to do 4 things principally. Invest in our staff, which means paying people equitably and competitively in the context of the marketplace, which we are not yet doing, and I think need to do in short order in order to live and breathe our mission. We wanted to institute, through establishing an endowment, a series of programs that sustain our institutional emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion as a value that will propel the museum forever into the future. And we recognize as a museum that that needs to be tended to on a daily basis, such that it really changes the identity at the core of the museum. We often claim that we're a free institution. and we are in large part, but we do still charge for our changing exhibitions. So those shows, many of which I just narrated to you, Joan Mitchell, The Great Migration, the Matisse exhibition, all come with considerable fees that help with the bottom line of the museum's annual operating. And so it's our conviction that we need to show those sort of jewels of our program free to the community. That requires an endowment of roughly 9.5 million. So we're aiming to generate those funds at the moment. And then finally, again, in service of accessibility, our evening hours are currently 10, or our hours of operation are currently 10 until 5 p.m. So those hours are incredibly prohibitive for anybody with a normal, inflexible working schedule. So we are, I believe, in the spring of 2022, introducing for the first time extended evening hours so that people with inflexible work schedules can come and experience the museum until 10 p.m. at night for free. So all of those 4 points are an extension of our emphasis on developing an internal culture of equity and diversity and maximizing public access to that world. So I think we've transitioned as an institution from having an aggressive focus on program, I would say, to an aggressive focus on policy as a complement. And it's my feeling that if you put those two emphases together, program and policy, then you develop a 360-degree view of an institution with equity and diversity at its core. So the next 5 years of my tenure here will have as its emphasis developing the funds necessary to complete the picture. And those 4 points are my primary emphasis within that effort. And I believe that's my last slide. And I believe that I have managed to give that warp speed presentation in 30 minutes. So thank you for listening. And I think we are going into a moderated discussion, so which I'm sure will be much more exciting.
Well, thank you so much, Christopher, for giving this run through your institution. From the sheer number of exhibitions you organized and realized and planned. It seems you're running 10 museums and not just one. So it is remarkable what you've done. And to give the audience a little bit of insight of how we proceed now, we have Thomas Köhler, who has graciously agreed to join us tonight, my esteemed colleague, to come to this virtual platform and forum to talk with us about this tonight's topic. And after I briefly introduced Thomas, who I guess all of you know, but I will still take the opportunity with a few sentences to introduce him, who will give us a very, very brief introduction to his museum, so we have, like, we're all on the same basis of knowledge and have the same starting point. And then we start an open discussion. I have a few questions prepared, but please, everybody, feel free to raise your hand, ask your questions. If you do not feel comfortable asking in English, please just post your questions on the chat, and Andrea Meyer from the table will pick it up and share it with us. So whatever you feel most convenient with doing. But for now, I am honored to introduce Thomas Köhler, who is the director of the Berlinische Galerie, Museum for Modern and Contemporary Art, Photography, and Architecture. He studied art history at the Universität Paris-Nanterre and at the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe Universität in Frankfurt. He obtained his PhD from the Technische University of Darmstadt with a dissertation on Donald Judd. But before even obtaining his PhD, he worked as an academic researcher at the Museum of Modern Art in Frankfurt, was a curator in residence at the Whitney Museum in New York. He was the program director at the 10th Documenta from 1996 to 97, head of communications at Kunstmuseum Wolfsburg, and in 2008 became the head of collections and exhibitions, as well as deputy director of the Berlinische Galerie, and serves as its director since 2010. And it's my great pleasure to welcome friend, colleague, and fellow museum director, Thomas Köhler, to the podium. So Thomas, please share insight into your institution.
Well, thank you for having me. Good evening. I suppose we're having an international audience, but still, I'd like to give some information on Berlinische Galerie, which has a rather brief history, I have to say. It was founded in 1975. It was a very ambitious foundation of a museum because it didn't have any form of collection. They just had office spaces in the very beginning. And then they moved from Schlossstraße in Charlottenburg, today Bröhan Museum is in that building. Then they moved to Jebenstraße, where for the first time they had exhibition spaces. And then they could finally relocate to the famous Martin Gropiusbau. So probably the most glamorous location we have ever been in. But when after reunification, when the museum landscape was reorganized in Berlin and the Gropiusbau had to undergo, Andrea, you can go into the first slide. Great, just the next one. Here you've got the brief history of Berlinische Galerie, and the glamorous years at Gropiusbau ended in 1998 when my predecessor had to move out because Gropiusbau became federal and Berlinische Galerie is a county museum, Landesmuseum. And as you can see, it took a while until Berlinische Galerie was able to move into a new building. 7 years. The museum was homeless, and it shows in a way how interested politicians at that time must have been in our work. And that's very existential question because, I mean, as I told you, Berlinische Galerie had started from scratch and no collection. So collecting became existential for my predecessors, and they accumulated a lot. Many surprises, I have to say, but it's for me a very, very challenging and fruitful experience to see such a museum, which was never quite well funded. It took 40 years until Berlinische Galerie received for the very first time an acquisition budget. This was in 2015. So after 40 years, for the first time, a little amount of money to buy art. And it took another 3 years until Berlinische Galerie finally received some kind of exhibition budget. So they never really treated us well, I have to say, without complaining, but collecting as an existential form of manifestation that the museum is important is still kind of in our DNA. My predecessors, they always had to be afraid to be extinguished. I mean, in the 90s, there was a study and they said, well, to solve the problems in Berlin, it would be very easy to like split up the collection of Berlinische Galerie. The good stuff should go to a national gallery and the, well, less important works should go to Stadtmuseum, to the city museum. So thank God, well, they didn't realize that kind of project. And today, I have to say, we're stronger than ever. But still, it's a museum without a strong architectural gesture. It's very modestly housed in a former glass storage. Can you continue, Andrea? Yeah, that's how Berlinische Galerie looked like before its transformation. And the next slide. Yeah, and that's how it looks today. I mean, you can see we have basically recycled an existing building. And today it's a classical white cube, but which is flexible enough to organize various forms of exhibitions. Yeah, the collection has grown rather fast. Could you go to the next slide? We have 5 departments today: fine art with painting and sculptures, photography, architecture, prints and drawings, and the artist's archives. So the focus, I should probably add, of Berlinische Galerie is to show and collect art produced in Berlin. And another focus would be the avant-garde movements, at least until the Second World War. And after the Second World War, of course, the beginnings after the war, the new beginnings became important, the abstract expressionism and the art in the separated city. And then, of course, another challenge occurred when reunification happened, and Berlinische Galerie, which was located in the West, had to become Berlinische Galerie, a museum for the whole city. So another challenge to like include the art production from East Berlin into our collection, which gradually happened. In some parts very easily, that is to say in photography, in other parts more with more difficulties. But in general, those were the challenges to like work on the gaps provoked by the National Socialist regime, which had expelled and destroyed so much of the art in Germany. And on the other hand, well, to document the new beginnings after the Second World War. And thirdly, to become a museum for Berlin as a whole. So, and meanwhile, I mean, we try to focus on the collection as much as we do focus on traveling exhibitions, because we feel we have to communicate with our communities. And outreach is just as important for us as, well, the organization of the travel of the exhibitions. We feel that each exhibition has to have a strong link with our collection. So most of what we do is coming directly from the collection. That is to say, up to 60 or 70% of each exhibition come from our collections. And that's an important factor, I'd say, because it's not only sustainable, I think, but it saves a lot of money. We believe that we can work easily with the works we have in our collection. You can see that's quite a lot. So we could have, well, years and years and years of programming using only the works of art which have been bought by my predecessors or which were donated to us, because that was really a problem. And I would never sell anything, I have to say, Mark, because I'm I'm so happy to have some major pieces in the collection, and that's the only works I could basically sell to make some money. But thank God, the system in Germany is so so much based on subsidies that we hopefully will never have to sell anything like that. So next slide, please. That's, for example, an exhibition focusing on our neighborhood, because Berlinische Galerie is in the neighborhood of an architecture made in architectural program realized in the 80s, international building exhibition. The area was devastated during the Second World War and only rebuilt in the 80s of the last century. So basically, we were working with the architecture, with the buildings around us, and invited everybody who lives in these buildings to join us for to see this exhibition. Go on, please, Andrea. Another example is Ferdinand Hodler and Modernist Berlin, an exhibition we're showing right now, and it's an attempt to reshape in a way the mission of Berlinische Galerie. So we're not only showing artists producing in Berlin, but at the same time we try to analyze the art market around 1900. And that's quite an interesting point to see how globalized Berlin was already acting around 1900. Go on. Yeah, and at the same time, and that's the principle, we're combining a show of the contemporary artist Alicia Quare with the exhibition of Ferdinand Hodler. And we experience this as a very precious a moment, because people coming expressively for Ferdinand Hodler, so a rather conservative public perhaps, they will be surprised when entering the museum and seeing this rather monumental intervention by contemporary artist Alicia Quare, who's focusing on a self-portrait by, well, reflecting on her, well, on the body substances of her human body and of her heartbeat. So this is just a little insight to give you an idea what we are actually doing. The Landesmuseum is still, well, compared to the state museums, I think we're more flexible, but on the other hand, we are less flexible because we have less money. But we have started to reshape and rethink and revision not only our collection, but all what we're doing, like communication, education, outreach, and everything we do. And that's, of course, a process which has to be financed. But thank God, as it's a political intention to reshape the museums and to, well, to restructure them, we can trust on the politicians, we can trust on the city of Berlin, on the land of Berlin, and they are giving us, thank God, enough money to initiate and to continue these transformations. Thank you. That's so much for for the first part.
Right. Thank you so much, Thomas. This has been, well, just one little remark. If the Berlinische Gallery is stronger than ever, that's primarily due to Thomas Köhler's work there, I have to say. But for tonight's talk and conversation, before we open the forum for everybody to join and ask questions, I would like to go back to one aspect. Chris, you in your presentation mentioned briefly, but that has stirred so much controversy, and that is maybe for a German audience rather unusual, because most museums in Germany simply cannot deaccession. However, in the States, the Association of Museum Directors changed guidelines that allowed you to do so. And for those who haven't followed it in the media, you did that in a first wave in 2018, where you successfully deaccessioned and bought works to diversify. And then the second move didn't go quite as successfully. And if I may quote from the Art newspaper article in 2020, it says, Bedford has set a brutal pace, pursuing what he termed a rapid, very aggressive, maybe reparations-based changed agenda. Or the Washington Post said, Baltimore Museum tried to raise money by selling 3 pricey artworks. It backfired stupendously. And these, I guess, are the more gentle voices to be heard in the press. And I know that some art market people were not as amused or not that amused about your move. My question would now be, if you do such a bold, some people call it aggressive move, did it pay off ultimately? Like, did you change, or have you produced different audiences? Do you have new audience? And do you allow this new audience to integrate their voices in your everyday business? Like, do you hear their voices, and how do they change your everyday business?
Yeah. Okay, so there are 2 questions in there, and a big prompt. So, just to address the first and the most prickly of them to begin with, I think that what we termed our endowment for the future effort, which entailed the sale of those 3 paintings, it was based on a desire, I think, to look with clear eyes at the way that American institutions have functioned historically. And to say that if we're serious about a change agenda, we're serious about taking care of our staff first and foremost, making sure that our staff is equitably compensated, ensuring that the public has equal unfettered access to the institution, ensuring that we aren't simply articulating values but living by them. We need to look at every avenue available to us to restructure and reimagine, with nothing being off the table. So, it's my view, and I think that it's a view shared by a growing group of, let's say, younger museum directors, that the asset at our core, meaning our collection, is itself the most emblematic aspect of our historical privilege and our historical bias. And that, like every other resource at our disposal, should be available to us when we reimagine ourselves in a different form. So, in addition to, I think, the BMA and myself in particular coming under fire at the end of 2020 for this proposed reparatory act, in parallel with that, you see activist groups and artists across the country railing against institutions that aren't doing enough to establish a culture of equity and diversity and inclusion within their institutions. And, for instance, having trustees that have generated vast wealth by doing questionable things, by sustaining staff cultures that are not sufficiently diverse and or abusive and toxic. So I think it's really important to bear in mind that there were 2 big stories structuring museum life in the US during the latter part of 20 and into 21. So we are the toast of the town when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you analyze our programs, exhibitions, and acquisitions, as well as board and staff constitution. So we weren't under fire in the way that some of our peers were. we were under fire for being too aggressive and too progressive. So I will say I stand, and I'm happy to talk through the 3 paintings and the rationale behind selling them. I stand behind the logic. I stand behind the value-based decision-making. I am hopeful that AAMD will extend its latitude around deaccessioning paintings to allow institutions to fund direct care of collection. And if that's extended, in perpetuity, I think that with that guardrail in place, I think it will give museums who are cash strapped on an annual basis the financial latitude to be more relevant and more present for their audiences. And if there's any incentive for that, it's the progress we've made in both growing and diversifying our audience. So if you, I think, listen to people, you're dialogic in your approach, you go to them, they come to you, and the playing field becomes intrinsically more equitable. So, I certainly have peers in the field who believe that the permanent collection is the sacred cow and should remain forever and always untouchable. I really fundamentally disagree with that. I think it is an aspect of conservative intellectual habit. It's not a law. It's a guideline within a discipline that has existed for a long time, and I think needs to be put under pressure precisely because artists and activist groups have called out, and justly, our shortcomings as institutions. So we have to move fast, and that requires resources. And one resource at our disposal is the collection.
Well, do you also, or don't you see that it could also set a dangerous precedent for other institutions just to, sell works just because it conveniently, raises their endowment or just fits in a certain, financial agenda? The board or the Association of Museum Directors agreed on doing that under COVID. So, museums or institutions under dire financial constraints had to respond to that, but it opened the floodgates for some who just conveniently sell major artworks. Could that, it could add to that fashion.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there have to be guardrails in place that prevent institutions from going too far. So the guardrail that they put in place was you can sell objects to fund the direct care of collection. I am of the position that creates enough financial latitude that institutions can begin in parallel with that budget relief to fund programs that intended to make their internal structures be reflective of their mission and vision statements, and to open up the museum's doors to a broader public through access-based programs. So I do believe in the guardrails. I'll also say that, what is more calamitous? A museum selling a painting, or seeking or sort of sinking into a condition of public irrelevance and internal inequity as a result of doing nothing? And I think it's been amply demonstrated to us that museums are not doing the good work at the moment. And so if the structure isn't working, I think it's incumbent upon museum leaders to be brave, be bold, to analyze what we're not doing and try to find a means of achieving a new future. And that does require money.
Yeah, you gave me a good point in public or being irrelevant to the public. And it's a question I would like to ask both of you, Thomas, and you, Christopher. And maybe in the meantime, if anybody else has questions, please raise your hand or click that raise button. But I have one last question to both of you. At the end of the day, if we just applied these two keywords, increasing accessibility and equality, do we still just remain just a museum, or does the change of the audience and the need for structural change demand more from us than just being a museum? Who wants to go first?
Well, if I may start, I mean, to ensure museum work, if it's necessary to sell art to ensure a museum work, it's wrong, in my eyes. The system is completely wrong, and I have to say, it's the difference we cannot change between the U.S. and Germany. And thank God I used to believe that America is the better home base. When I was working at the Whitney, I was really fascinated by the powerful museum there, like the board of trustees with like Coca-Cola and other big companies. I was like, oh my God, this is so impressive. What they can do is amazing. It's amazing what they can buy, what they can build. Wow. And I said, that's great. And that's fascinating. I want to stay. But meanwhile, I grew older, and I think that this culture based on private money and on the grace of like private money givers is completely wrong. I mean, if you have to sell a work of art to open your museum, that's really, really bad. And actually, Dorothy, I checked the museum law in Germany, in Berlin. I could sell. I was surprised when I found that out. I could sell. It says if the board agrees, you can sell. But I do think that they meant it differently, that they probably were thinking about like giving works away to eliminate redundancy or anything like that. But I mean, that was something I really found out when I was preparing for that lecture, for that evening. I could, but I would think it's completely wrong. It's a public museum, and the public money has to be used to finance a museum, to finance the museum as a communication platform. And I don't want to give anything away to ensure that an outreach curator can actually work. That's my main idea. It's probably bad to criticize the American system, but it's a very inhuman way, I have to say. I mean, talking about pay equity, it sounds so weird, because I mean, we do have the tariff system. Everybody gets the same, women and men. So I think, there's a way to go for American museums. It's probably very arrogant to say that from a German perspective, but I think, yeah, we're really on a good way here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with almost everything that you've said thus far, Thomas. I mean, I think it's a benefit. The American system is a benefit and a burden. It's one that we exist within, and when it works extraordinarily well. And when it doesn't, you encounter not insurmountable obstacles, but enormous challenges. So we receive pretty de minimis support from the state of Maryland. We receive pretty de minimis support from the city of Baltimore. In the scheme of our annual operating budget, they give generous allocations, but nothing, taking a small bite out of our roughly $20 million a year annual operating budget. So we have to scratch and claw through individuals, foundations, corporations, and principally our board of trustees to make up the difference. And one of the reasons and this I think is really fascinating, and something I probably wouldn't have conjured had you not made your comments. One of the reasons to emphasize endowment growth is precisely to liberate a museum creatively from any constraints. So whereas museums in Germany rely on the government to provide subsidy, which is fabulous, museums in this country rely on exhibition foundations, individuals, corporations, and primarily endowments. So one goal that we've set for ourselves is if we have an endowment of $400 million, that would spin off $20 million a year, meaning that none of that fundraising would be necessary, and the curators working within the institution would have pure creative liberty without any reliance on any external forces, including advocacy from the board of trustees. So in a certain sense, what I am attempting to do through adding to the endowment is provide for something equivalent to the state support that you enjoy within the context of Germany as a country. But that kind of support, sustaining support that removes all of the fundraising burden from the institution, is very unlikely to come from federal, state, or city-based governmental support. It's just simply beyond, it's either beyond the reach of those agencies or beyond the appetite of those agencies to do it. So we're forced into a position where we have to look for other sources on an annual basis. And this is probably quite foreign to you. I feel that my job here, directing the BMA, is split between 2 points of focus: a sort of uniquely creative vision to drive the program of the institution and the money to support it. And I would say that that second point, the money to support it, accounts for substantially more than half of my time.
I just wanted to be provocative because that's quite your dilemma.
I mean,
sorry
we don't
for
have
that.
this conversation in this country
Sorry
at all.
for that,
but
Chris.
No, it's great. It's fabulous. I think that we don't have that conversation within the context of American institutions, because the idea that such an infusion of governmental money into our institutions is so remote as a possibility, nobody even really entertains it. But it's a really good prompt for me to hear.